The morning air was thick with tension. It was the kind of stillness that precedes a storm, the air heavy with anticipation and dread. In the distance, a faint echo of artillery fire reverberated across the rugged landscape. German soldiers, their faces grim and weary, lined up along the barbed wire, eyes fixed ahead, waiting. The men had just spent weeks in a desperate struggle on the front lines of the Eastern Front. And now, with the collapse of their defenses, the inevitable had come. They were captured. As they were marched into the prisoner of war camp, their minds were clouded with thoughts of what awaited them: grueling forced labor, starvation rations, the brutal hands of their captors. Yet, as the gates to their new reality closed behind them, the sight that greeted them was something entirely unexpected. Neatly laid tables with warm, steaming cups of coffee and freshly baked bread that filled the air with a tantalizing aroma. They stared in disbelief. Could this be true? Was this a trick? The harsh propaganda that had painted the enemy as nothing more than savages seemed to have no place here. This moment would set the stage for an extraordinary transformation, one that would shatter their beliefs about the enemy and force them to reconsider everything they had ever known about captivity, humanity, and the very nature of war itself. The story of the German prisoners of war, or POWs, who were captured on the Eastern Front during World War II and found themselves in an unexpectedly humane environment, begins in the midst of a global conflict that reshaped history. The war, already raging for years, had reached a critical juncture in 1943. The tide of battle had shifted, and the Allies were slowly gaining ground against the Axis powers. On the Eastern Front, the German Wehrmacht, once invincible, was being relentlessly pushed back by the Soviet Red Army. The brutal winter of 1941 had decimated German forces, but it wasn't until the Battle of Stalingrad that the German advance was truly halted. The Germans, entrenched in defensive positions and facing a relentless Soviet offensive, began to lose their grip on the territories they had once conquered. In the chaotic months that followed Stalingrad, many German soldiers, disillusioned and defeated, found themselves captured by the Soviets. These men, hardened by years of combat, had heard the rumors and the warnings. Soviet POW camps were notorious for their inhumane conditions. The soldiers had been fed a steady diet of propaganda, told that the Soviets were brutal, uncivilized, and merciless. The prisoners had been taught to fear what lay ahead: cruel, neglect, beatings, and forced labor. They expected to be treated as less than human, starved, worked to the bone, and discarded like expendable tools of war. But what they experienced in the Soviet POW camps was not what they had anticipated. The Allied war machine, unlike the narrative they had been told, didn't always operate in the ruthless way they had imagined. Instead, many prisoners found themselves receiving food that was more than just sustenance. It was comfort. Fresh bread, hot coffee, and even vegetables were served regularly. This contrast to the grim propaganda they had been fed back in Germany would become a source of profound confusion and, for some, a turning point. This episode in history forces us to confront the central question of this story. What happens when war and propaganda meet reality? How do preconceived beliefs about the enemy, shaped by years of ideological warfare, crumble when confronted with acts of unexpected kindness? The story of these German POWs offers an opportunity to explore the complexities of wartime captivity, the fallibility of propaganda, and the humanity that can emerge even in the darkest of circumstances. By focusing on these German soldiers' initial experiences in captivity, this narrative will explore the environment they were thrust into. The sharp contrast between the propaganda they had been taught to believe and the unexpected reality they faced is both compelling and unsettling. But it also raises larger questions about the nature of war itself. How much do we truly know about our enemies when we are guided by the voices of war, rather than the truths of human interaction? The reality of captivity was, for many of these German soldiers, more complex than they could have ever imagined. They had been trained to view the Soviets as barbaric, uncaring monsters. Yet, the men who captured them and who held them in camps were offering them something that could never have been expected: basic human decency. The guards, though soldiers in a brutal war, presented a stark contrast to the monstrous image that the prisoners had been taught to fear. As these prisoners woke each morning to coffee and bread, they found themselves caught in a moral dilemma. Could these simple acts of kindness be a genuine reflection of their captor's nature? Or was there a more sinister reason behind the hospitality they received? Perhaps a calculated tactic meant to break their morale and force them to abandon their loyalty to the Nazi cause. The prisoners, unable to reconcile their training with what they were experiencing, began to question the very foundation of their beliefs. And yet, this shift wasn't immediate. For many, the suspicion and fear ran deep. The prisoners were, after all, in the hands of their enemy, and no act could completely erase the years of propaganda and hatred that had been drilled into their minds. But as they settled into their new environment, they began to realize that their captivity wasn't entirely what they had expected. What began as a gesture of disbelief, a meal of coffee and fresh bread, would soon evolve into a profound personal and ideological transformation for many of them. This story isn't just about food, though. It's about the psychological transformation that occurs when long-held beliefs are confronted by an entirely different reality. It's about the questions of morality and humanity that arise in the midst of war, when the line between friend and foe blurs, and the distinctions between good and evil become increasingly difficult to maintain. In the weeks that followed their capture, many of these soldiers were forced to confront their captors in a way that they had never anticipated. Their minds, shaped by years of ideological warfare, began to unearth a series of contradictions that would challenge everything they had believed up until that point. This was not just a clash between two military forces. It was a confrontation between two vastly different worldviews, each shaped by its own history, culture, and propaganda. The German POWs, for the first time, found themselves in the uncomfortable position of being the ones who were vulnerable, the ones who had to submit. And yet, as they did, they found themselves receiving a form of humanity that was unimaginable. The food, the coffee, the bread. It was a subtle form of resistance to the brutality that they had been taught to expect. For many, it represented an uncomfortable truth, that their enemies were not the monsters they had been led to believe. And in that uncomfortable realization lay the seeds of a transformation that would shape their understanding of war, humanity, and themselves. The German soldiers who found themselves captured on the Eastern Front were, in many ways, the product of a brutal and unforgiving war. By the time of their capture, they had already endured years of fighting on multiple fronts, facing unimaginable hardships. The scale of the war was unprecedented. Millions had already died, cities had been leveled, and entire nations had been pushed to the brink of collapse. The Wehrmacht, once a symbol of military might, was now being pushed back on every front. The Soviet Union, which had once seemed an unmanageable adversary, had become an unstoppable force, and the men of the German army found themselves trapped in a cycle of constant retreat. These prisoners had been in battle for months on end. They were weary, cold, and, above all, fearful. The Eastern Front, with its vicious winters and brutal terrain, had already taken a devastating toll. The soldiers had fought fiercely, but the Soviet forces, bolstered by sheer numbers and the growing strength of their resistance, were closing in. As German positions crumbled, so did the soldiers' sense of invincibility. Many of them had watched as their comrades were killed in action, and others had been severely wounded. Yet, despite the horror they had witnessed, the propaganda machine in Germany continued to present the war as one of righteous cause, urging the soldiers to hold the line no matter the cost. When they were finally captured, there was no fanfare, no glory in the surrender. The cold of the steppe wrapped around them like a blanket, heavy and unyielding. Their arms raised in surrender, the soldiers were met with Soviet captors who, though equally weary from their own suffering, held the upper hand. The German soldiers were marched through the bitter winds of winter to a POW camp, where their fate would be decided. They had been taught to fear this moment, to fear the Soviet POW camps where rumors of starvation, torture, and brutality ran rampant. They had been warned time and time again about what awaited them in the hands of the Soviets. Prisoners would be worked to death, their bodies ravaged by illness and hunger, their morale shattered by cruelty. Yet, as the soldiers entered the camp, they noticed something strange. The air was different. It was not filled with the sounds of harsh commands or the smell of decay. Instead, there was an almost surreal sense of order. The first thing that struck them was the food. They had expected nothing but stale bread and a few morsels of meat. Instead, they were greeted by the smell of freshly baked bread, hot from the oven, and warm cups of coffee that steamed in the cold air. For men who had lived on little more than rationed scraps for months, this was nothing short of a miracle. But it wasn't just the food that caught them off guard. It was the overall atmosphere of the camp. The Soviets, who had been painted as heartless brutes, appeared calm and almost detached in their dealings with the prisoners. There was no cruelty in their eyes, no harshness in their voices. The camp was not a place of constant fear, but rather one of cold efficiency. For the German soldiers, who had been taught that the Soviets were nothing more than savage enemies, this was disorienting. In their minds, the Soviet Union had been demonized as a land of barbarism, where human life had little value and only brute force could win the day. They had been told that the Soviet soldiers were little more than machines of war, devoid of emotion and compassion. This narrative had been drilled into their minds from the moment they enlisted. Propaganda had painted the Soviets as the enemy in every sense of the word, uncivilized, ruthless, and subhuman. The German soldiers had learned to believe that the Soviet people were nothing like themselves, that they had no honor or respect for life. But now, standing in this strange camp, they were confronted with something entirely different. They were being treated not as subhuman beings, but as prisoners, men to be fed, housed, and kept alive. The bread and coffee were symbols of something far greater than mere sustenance. They were signs of respect, a form of dignity that the prisoners had not expected to receive. For many of them, this small act of kindness was difficult to comprehend. How could it be? How could their captors, who they had been taught to despise, be so human? As the days went by, the prisoners were given more than just food. They were given beds to sleep in, medical care for their wounds, and even small luxuries like soap and clean clothes. These were things they had never anticipated receiving from their captors. The propaganda they had consumed back home had painted an image of the enemy that was utterly incompatible with the reality they were experiencing. The Soviet guards, despite their position as the enemy, were offering them what seemed like the very basics of human kindness. This stark contrast created a growing sense of confusion and disbelief among the prisoners. They had been prepared for cruelty, but they were experiencing something entirely different. At first, the soldiers struggled to make sense of what was happening. Their training and beliefs told them to reject this new reality, to continue seeing their captors as monsters. But the comforts they were receiving, a hot meal, a warm bed, and a sense of order, were hard to ignore. And so, the questions began to surface. Were the Soviets truly the savages they had been led to believe? Or was there something more to this situation, something deeper, more complex, than the one-dimensional caricature they had been shown? The soldiers' first days in captivity were filled with a growing sense of inner turmoil. They were caught between the propaganda that had shaped their entire worldview and the uncomfortable reality they now faced. Could the enemy really be so different from themselves? Could these Soviet captors, who offered food and shelter, be driven by something other than hatred? The answers would not come easily, And the German prisoners would have to confront these questions as their time in captivity unfolded. The days following their capture were filled with confusion and disbelief for the German POWs. The initial shock of being taken prisoner by the Soviet forces, who they had been taught to regard as the enemy in the most savage sense, was compounded by the disorienting reality of their new existence in the Soviet camp. The prisoners, now separated from their comrades and their weapons, began to feel the weight of captivity. They had expected to face unimaginable hardship, yet what greeted them was beyond what they could have anticipated. The first surprise was the food. The German soldiers, who had endured months of starvation and rationing, found themselves seated at long tables filled with warm, freshly baked bread. The smell alone was enough to make their stomachs churn with longing. This was a luxury they hadn't known in years. Coffee, rich and steaming, was placed before them, its aroma filling the camp and mingling with the cold air. For many, it felt like a dream. They could scarcely believe their eyes. Had the Soviets truly prepared such a meal for them? Or was this some cruel trick? Their minds raced with disbelief. In the midst of a brutal war, these captors were offering them sustenance, not cruelty. The experience left many of the soldiers wondering if this was just a temporary reprieve, a momentary gesture designed to lull them into a false sense of comfort before the real horrors of captivity would begin. But as the days turned into weeks, the reality began to sink in. This wasn't a fleeting kindness. Every morning, the prisoners were given fresh bread and hot coffee. There were vegetables, soups, and sometimes even meat. It wasn't the meager rations they had expected. It was an abundance, a stark contrast to the horrific propaganda they had been fed in Germany. For the German prisoners, the contrast was jarring. They had been trained to believe that the Soviet Union was a land of desolation and brutality, where food was scarce and lives were expendable. Yet, here they were, receiving meals that were not only edible, but plentiful. The unexpected kindness began to challenge everything they had been told about the enemy. They began to ask themselves, how could this be? How could these men, who had fought against them for years, be offering them something so simple, yet so profound? This moment of confusion and disbelief didn't stop at food. The living conditions in the camp were, in many respects, better than what they had been used to. The prisoners were housed in clean barracks, far more comfortable than the cramped, disease-ridden trenches or the freezing dugouts they had endured on the front lines. There was no overcrowding, no filth, no pervasive stench of decay. The beds were simple but adequate, and the air was clear. There were no signs of neglect, no marks of the cruelty they had been led to expect. They could hardly believe it. The high propaganda had promised them hell, yet here they were, in what felt like a somewhat humane environment. For many of these men, the first few days were filled with an overwhelming sense of uncertainty. Were these acts of kindness simply a tactic designed to make them compliant or to break their morale? Was the Soviets' generosity a form of psychological manipulation intended to make them question their loyalty to Germany? In their minds, the Soviets had been demonized as the epitome of evil. The idea of kindness from the enemy was simply unfathomable. They were caught between suspicion and an uncomfortable sense of gratitude. Each meal, each act of care, chipped away at the rigid framework of hatred they had built up over the years. Letters from fellow soldiers back home, written with the same bitter tones of nationalism and pride, added to the confusion. In these letters, the men were encouraged to view their captors with contempt and fear. Yet, what they were experiencing didn't align with the narrative they had been fed. One prisoner, Heinrich, wrote in his diary, "Every morning, I wait for the guards to come with their brutal hands ready to deliver blows. But instead, they bring us food, real food, Hot food. It feels like a sick joke. I wonder, are we the ones being played? Or are we the ones playing ourselves? Heinrich's words were filled with doubt. He was confused and unsettled by the kindness, unsure whether he should accept it or resist it. The deeper psychological impact began to manifest as the prisoners interacted more with their captors. The Soviet guards, though soldiers in their own right, seemed remarkably different from the savage, bloodthirsty images that had been painted for them. They weren't cruel or callous. They weren't shouting or striking the prisoners, as they had been taught to expect. In fact, many of the guards appeared to be just as weary as the prisoners themselves, carrying the burden of war with a sense of quiet exhaustion. There were moments of rare, quiet exchanges between the prisoners and their captors, small gestures of humanity, like a guard giving a soldier an extra piece of bread, or sharing a cigarette during a rare break. These fleeting acts created a deeper sense of unease among the prisoners. Were they truly in the hands of their enemies, or were they simply pawns in a larger game? As the days passed, the prisoners' initial reactions to their environment began to change. Some became disillusioned, their anger at being captured waning in the face of such kindness. Others began to question the righteousness of their cause. The Soviet POW camp, which they had once seen as a place of torment, had turned into a space of basic human decency. Some prisoners even began to feel ashamed, shame for the years of blind hatred they had directed towards their captors, shame for having been raised in a culture that taught them to despise and fear the very people who were now offering them comfort. The more time they spent in captivity, the more they realized how much of their worldview had been shaped by falsehoods and propaganda. But this internal struggle didn't come without resistance. The bitterness of captivity, the humiliation of defeat, and the stark contrast between their expectations and reality led to a growing sense of resentment for some prisoners. They couldn't reconcile the two opposing truths, the brutal Soviet soldier and the compassionate human being. Was this kindness a ruse? Was there some hidden agenda behind the seemingly benevolent actions? Or was it possible that the lines between good and evil were not as clear-cut as they had been led to believe? As they sat each morning with their coffee and bread, the question lingered in their minds. How much of their understanding of the enemy was a construct? And what, if anything, could they trust about the world they had fought to defend? As the days wore on in the Soviet POW camp, the initial shock of food and shelter began to give way to deeper contradictions. The prisoners, still struggling to reconcile the kindness they were receiving with the brutality they had been taught to expect, started to encounter more perplexing details that only added to the dissonance between their beliefs and reality. What had once been simple confusion began to evolve into a more complex internal conflict, one that stirred emotions, doubts, and, for some, profound personal transformations. The first unsettling realization came when the prisoners were put to work. They had been led to believe that in Soviet camps, prisoners were treated as expendable laborers, forced to toil in harsh conditions until they dropped from exhaustion. Yet, in the Soviet camp, the work was relatively light. There were no grueling hours of back-breaking labor, no incessant beatings for falling behind. The work assignments varied. Some men were tasked with building, others with cleaning, and still others with assisting in the camp's day-to-day operations. Though the work was hard and the conditions less than ideal, it was nothing compared to the horrors they had been prepared for. In fact, many of the prisoners found themselves completing tasks that, under different circumstances, they would have found fairly routine. The work was a far cry from the inhumane labor they had been told to expect. Even more surprising was the way the prisoners were treated by the Soviet workers in charge of overseeing them. These guards, who had been painted as savage, bloodthirsty oppressors, were surprisingly cooperative. Instead of harshly reprimanding the prisoners for mistakes or slowing down, Many guards offered quiet encouragement. When one prisoner, Carl, dropped a load of bricks while working, the guard simply nodded and said, "Next time, slower. It's okay." The words were simple, but the tone was one of understanding, not anger. For Carl, this was a jarring experience. It contradicted everything he had been taught. His whole life had been spent in a culture of strict discipline, and yet, in this camp, he found himself faced with a different kind of order, one that was not built on punishment or fear, but on a strange, unexpected form of patience and understanding. Another stark contradiction lay in the interactions between the prisoners and the Soviet citizens they met on occasional work assignments outside the camp. The soldiers had been told that the Soviet people hated Germans with a passion and would see their captivity as an opportunity to exact revenge. Yet, when the prisoners were sent to work in local fields or help with construction, they encountered ordinary Soviet civilians, farmers, workers, and shopkeepers, who seemed remarkably indifferent to their presence. In some instances, prisoners were even offered small tokens of kindness. One soldier, Jurgen, recalled in a letter to his family that a Soviet farmer had given him a piece of bread, saying only, "For you, not for the enemy." Jurgen was stunned. Here he was, a captured enemy soldier, receiving bread from someone who had every reason to despise him. The emotional weight of that simple act of kindness began to chip away at his worldview. This moment, along with others like it, began to change the way the prisoners viewed their captors. The distance between enemy and victim started to feel less absolute. They had been raised to believe in an impenetrable divide between us and them, between the German soldier and the Soviet citizen. But these everyday encounters forced them to confront the uncomfortable reality that the lines between the two groups were not as clear-cut as they had been led to believe. The Russians, they realized, were not so different after all. They were human beings, not faceless monsters. The mental shift was slow, but undeniable. Prisoners who had initially viewed the Soviets with suspicion and fear began to grapple with the idea that their captors might not be so different from themselves. There were still moments of hostility, moments when the sharp edge of war made itself known. Yet, these were increasingly rare compared to the overwhelming acts of small kindnesses that the prisoners had begun to experience. And as the days went by, some of the men found themselves questioning their deeply ingrained beliefs about the war, about the enemy, and about humanity itself. But it wasn't just the acts of kindness that unsettled the prisoners. There were also the moments of silence, when the men could only reflect on their own complicity in the war. Many of the soldiers had entered the conflict believing in the righteousness of their cause. They had been taught that the war was not only just, but necessary. They had been raised in a culture where patriotism and loyalty to the state were paramount, and they had learned to see the Soviet Union as an evil to be destroyed. But in this camp, surrounded by the very people they had been taught to hate, the prisoners found themselves forced to confront the futility of their beliefs. A particularly striking moment occurred when one of the prisoners, Heinrich, found himself in conversation with a Soviet guard about the war. Initially, Heinrich had expected to face hostility or to be treated with contempt. But instead, the guard, Ivan, spoke with an air of quiet resignation, as if the war had taken a toll on both sides. "We are all just men," Ivan had said, his voice almost sorrowful. "Both of us, we have lost." Heinrich was stunned by the admission. How could the enemy, who had been so demonized in their minds, be capable of such understanding? The words echoed in Heinrich's mind for days, and he found himself questioning not just the propaganda, but his own sense of morality. If the war was truly about defeating evil, how could he reconcile this moment of shared humanity with the violence and hatred that had been instilled in him? As the contradictions piled up, the prisoners found themselves caught in a moral and psychological web of their own making. They had entered captivity with clear-cut beliefs about who they were and who the enemy was. But now, they found themselves facing a reality that didn't fit the narrative they had been taught to accept. The Soviets were not just the enemy. They were people with lives, struggles, and emotions of their own. And in that realization, a deep, uncomfortable truth began to emerge. The true enemy was not just the soldiers standing across from them, but the propaganda that had painted the world in such stark, black and white terms. With each passing day, the prisoners were forced to wrestle with this new reality. They had been given food, shelter, and even small acts of kindness. They had been shown that their captors, those soldiers in a brutal war, were capable of humanity. And as the dissonance between their expectations and reality continued to grow, the question became clear. Could they continue to view the Soviets as nothing more than the enemy? Or had their perceptions of war, of loyalty, and of humanity been forever altered? As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the mental and emotional transformations among the German POWs became more pronounced. What had begun as a series of contradictions, small moments of kindness, unexpected comforts, and the unsettling realization that the Soviets were not the demons they had been led to believe, now reached a dramatic climax. The prisoners were no longer just caught between suspicion and confusion. They were experiencing a profound internal conflict that would change their understanding of the war, of themselves, and of their captors. It wasn't just the food or the shelter that had unsettled them. It was the gradual accumulation of experiences, each one a small but powerful shift in perspective. The prisoners had, over time, been treated not as slaves to be broken, but as human beings deserving of care. Their wounds were tended to by Soviet doctors. Their physical needs were met with regularity. But, more than that, their emotional and psychological needs were slowly being addressed in a way that was unimaginable. The propaganda they had been fed in Germany had portrayed the Soviets as brutal, inhuman monsters. But, in the face of the IB, Soviets' humanity, those beliefs crumbled piece by piece until they could no longer sustain the soldiers' worldview. One moment that crystallized this transformation occurred during a particularly harsh winter. The prisoners were assigned to work outside in the snow, unloading supplies for the camp. The cold was biting, and the work was exhausting. At some point, one of the prisoners, Otto, collapsed from exhaustion, his body too weak to continue. The Soviet guard, seeing the young man on the ground, rushed over to help. At first, Otto resisted, unwilling to accept help from the very person who, in his mind, represented the enemy. But the guard's insistence, gentle but firm, left Otto with no choice but to accept. The guard helped him up and, with a small smile, handed him a cup of warm tea. The act was simple, but to Otto, it felt like an epiphany. In that moment, he realized that the man helping him wasn't the enemy he had been taught to hate. He was just another soldier, caught in the same web of war, trying to survive. Otto's internal battle had been won in an instant. He no longer saw his captors as faceless monsters. They were human beings, just as he was. This moment was pivotal for many of the prisoners, for it represented the breakdown of the ideological walls they had spent years building. They had come to this camp expecting to be treated as subhuman, yet they had been treated with a level of humanity that was difficult to accept. It was a reality that couldn't be ignored. In the following days, many of the men, formerly bitter and resentful, began to speak more openly about their changing perspectives. They began to express the realization that their captors, far from being the bloodthirsty enemies they had been warned about, were simply soldiers in the same cruel war. They had families, loved ones, and dreams of their own, just as the German soldiers did. The turning point came during a rare meeting with Soviet officials, when the prisoners were brought together for a discussion. Initially, they had expected the usual political lectures and propaganda. But this time, the Soviet officer in charge spoke differently. He spoke not of victory over the enemy, but of the need for peace, for the end of the bloodshed. His words were not laced with the rhetoric of hatred that the prisoners had been taught to expect. Instead, he spoke of human suffering, of the sacrifices made by both sides in the war. And as he spoke, a strange sense of solidarity began to emerge among the prisoners. They realized that the enemy they had been taught to despise was no different from themselves. They were soldiers, too, fighting not just for their countries, but for survival. The most dramatic shift came when the prisoners were told that they would soon be released and sent back to Germany. The moment they had been awaiting, the moment of liberation, arrived. Yet, it was not a moment of triumph or celebration. The men were conflicted. Many had expected to feel a sense of relief at being freed, but instead, they felt a deep sense of loss. They had spent months in the Soviet camp, and in that time, they had formed bonds with their captors that were hard to sever. Some of the prisoners were even reluctant to leave. They had been treated with dignity, they had been given care, and they had been shown humanity in a way they never imagined possible. The notion of returning to Germany, to a life filled with the same ideological fervor and hatred, was now deeply troubling to them. In the final moments before their departure, a few of the prisoners approached their Soviet captors, unsure of how to express the gratitude they now felt. Words seemed insufficient, but the emotions were powerful. One prisoner, Wilhelm, shook the hand of his guard, Ivan, and said simply, "Thank you for showing me the truth." Ivan, the Soviet guard, nodded solemnly. For a brief moment, they stood together in silence, two men who had once been enemies, now bound by a shared humanity. As the prisoners made their way back to Germany, they were faced with the daunting task of reintegrating into a society that had been shaped by the very propaganda they had now come to question. Many found it difficult to reconcile their experiences with the ideals they had been raised with. Some struggled to fit back into their old lives, while others found a new purpose, one that was less about hatred and more about understanding. But for all, the journey home was not just a physical one, it was a journey of transformation. The men who returned to Germany were not the same men who had left. They were no longer prisoners of war, but prisoners of their own beliefs, forced to confront the contradictions they had carried with them for so long. This transformation didn't just affect the individual soldiers, it rippled out into their communities, their families, and even the broader post-war society. The war had left scars on everyone, but it had also opened the door to a new understanding of the enemy, and, in many ways, of themselves. In the aftermath of their captivity, many of the former POWs spoke out about their experiences, challenging the ideological narratives that had shaped their lives. They told stories of the humanity they had found in their captors, of the kindness that had been shown to them, and of the lessons they had learned about the true nature of war. As the years went by, the experience of these POWs became a part of the broader narrative of post-war Europe. It was a story of loss, but also of redemption, a story of how, even in the most unlikely of circumstances, the bonds of humanity could be stronger than the divisions created by war. In the years following their liberation, many of the former POWs who had been held in Soviet camps struggled to return to their former lives. The war had shattered not just their bodies, but their worldview, and the experience of captivity had forced them to confront the very foundations of the ideologies they had once sworn to uphold. They had entered captivity as staunch believers in the righteousness of their cause, but they left with a transformed understanding of war, humanity, and the enemy. The story of these prisoners speaks not just to the complexities of war, but to the ways in which propaganda can shape and distort our perceptions of others. It challenges us to rethink the narratives we are taught to believe, to question the divisions that are so often drawn between us and them. In a world still marked by conflict and division, The story of these men reminds us that even in the darkest of times, there is always the potential for humanity to shine through, often in the most unexpected places. What remains, in the end, is the lesson that even in the most brutal circumstances, we are all capable of change, of growth, and of seeing the humanity in those we once thought to be our enemies. And perhaps, in that realization, lies the hope for a more peaceful future.